Inside the ER, doctors were baffled. Why would a child with no injuries have a heartbeat fading like that? She was just a shadow on a snowy road. Small, silent, nearly frozen. No ID, no name. Just a dog who wouldn't leave her side. And a quiet officer with too much grief in his chest to ignore the pull. What Bran the German Shepherd uncovered next led not only to a rescue, but to something no one expected, a beginning. Have you ever wondered how a stranger, a child, and a dog can quietly become a family? If you've ever believed in small miracles or the power of staying, watch until the end. And tell us, who in your life refused to walk away when you needed it most? Missoula, Montana. The kind of place where the snow didn't just fall, it stayed. On rooftops, on tree branches, on mailboxes, on memory. It was past midnight when Officer Caleb Warren turned off the headlights and let the patrol car idle at the edge of Alder Street. The town was a muted hush, snow absorbing even the faintest noise, no cars, no footsteps, just the soft click of the engine cooling and the rhythmic breathing of the dog beside him. Bran. The German Shepherd sat alert on the passenger seat, his body tense but not rigid, ears forward, eyes watching the empty world like it mattered. Inside the car, Caleb kept the heater low. Not because he liked the cold, he didn't, but because too much warmth lulled him into thoughts he had no use for. So instead, there was just enough heat to keep his fingers from stiffening and enough silence to keep him from pretending he wasn't alone. He didn't listen to music. He hadn't in 3 winters. There was something about these streets, under snow, under stars, that demanded reverence, and maybe something else, something like grief, wearing the voice of wind. He turned onto Hemlock Avenue. Street lamps lined the road like ghosts, their light blurred by soft falling flurries. The town's Christmas decorations still hung across Main, red ribbons gone pale, wire reindeer half buried under snowdrifts. Bran shifted beside him, a low, almost inaudible whine. Caleb glanced over. Then he saw it. At first, it looked like nothing, a thin pink thread dragged across the blanket of white, disappearing toward the sidewalk's edge. Caleb braked gently, the tires crunching softly, and reached for the door. Bran was already moving. Outside, the air bit into Caleb's neck, sharp and full of pine. The world held its breath. Only the sound of paws landing softly, deliberately. Bran followed the trail with the quiet grace of something born for snow. Then he stopped. A small figure lay curled near the edge of a parked truck, half buried where the snow had drifted against the wheels. She was motionless, knees tucked in, arms wrapped around her middle, hair matted to one side. No coat, no gloves, just a threadbare dress under a windbreaker much too thin for Montana in January. Caleb dropped to one knee. The child, a girl, maybe 8 or 9, had lips tinged blue and fingers raw and swollen with cold. No visible wounds, no blood beyond the faint smudge in the snow behind her. But something was wrong. Her face was too still, not unconscious, not quite, but somewhere deeper than sleep. Bran didn't bark, he didn't growl. He walked forward with careful steps, then lowered his body beside the girl, pressing close without touching. A silent offering. His head turned slightly, watching her with an intent that Caleb had only seen once before. The night Bran had refused to leave his side after the explosion, after the fire. A long pause passed. No one spoke, no sirens, no neighbor doors opening, no one shouting for a missing girl. Just this child, just the cold, just the dog who refused to move. Caleb reached out, his hand brushed the girl's shoulder, and her body shivered almost imperceptibly. He bent lower, checking her pulse. Faint, uneven. But there. He glanced once at Bran, and Bran's eyes met his. That was enough. Gently, Caleb lifted the girl into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. Too light. The way her body curled inward, not from pain, but from habit, made something inside him ache in a place he thought had gone quiet. She didn't cry, didn't stir, just let her head fall against his chest with a breath so soft it barely touched the air. Bran followed, silent and sure, as Caleb hurried back to the cruiser. The heater roared when he turned it up full. He wrapped his own coat around the girl, laying her across the back seat, and Bran jumped in without command, curling once more beside her. Caleb drove. Lights blurred, streets passed, but in the mirror, all he saw was Bran, lying still, eyes fixed on the girl, as if willing her not to drift further than she already had. As the hospital's lights rose over the hill, flickering like the last warm place in the world, Caleb said quietly into the dark, "Hold on, kid." But he wasn't sure who he was saying it to. The sliding doors of St. Patrick Hospital parted with a hush, the warmth inside clashing sharply with the cold Caleb had carried in his arms. The fluorescent lights above washed everything in sterile white, floors that shone like glass, the faint antiseptic sting in the air, the low hum of machines humming like breath held too long. Caleb moved quickly but steadily, boots wet with snow, his uniform darkened by melted flakes. In his arms, the girl remained still, her breath fluttering against his neck in shallow, unreliable patterns. Her skin, waxy and pale, made her seem even smaller than she was, as if the cold had tried to erase her. At his side, Bran moved like a shadow, silent and constant, his presence commanding enough that no nurse dared question the dog's right to be there. At the intake desk, an older nurse named Colleen looked up and gasped softly. She was used to injuries, to blood and pain and shouting, but something about this child's silence, the way her fists stayed curled against her chest even in unconsciousness, struck her harder than any siren. She stood without a word, already signaling down the hallway, and two younger nurses emerged pushing a gurney. Caleb placed the girl gently down, his arms reluctant to let go, and Bran took position at the head of the stretcher, tail low, muscles taut. The staff moved quickly, wheeling the girl into the trauma bay. One nurse tried to shoo the dog away, but Caleb shook his head once, firm. "He stays." And Bran didn't move, just followed with a gaze that made no room for argument. Inside the trauma room, voices rose, not in panic but in layered urgency. Vitals were taken. IVs were threaded into narrow veins, heated blankets wrapped around the small body. "No ID," Colleen said aloud, reading from the clipboard. "No known allergies. Found unresponsive in snow, Midtown. Unknown trauma." A younger resident reached to remove the girl's torn jacket. Beneath it, her sweater clung to her skin, damp, stretched, and pilled from overwashing. When they rolled it up to place monitoring pads, the room paused. Faint bruises, faded yellow and soft purple, ran across the curve of her ribs. They weren't fresh. They weren't from a fall. No one said anything, but the silence was loud. Bran lay on the floor near the head of the bed, unmoving but watching every hand that reached toward the girl. His breath came in slow, deliberate sighs. Occasionally, one ear would flick, but otherwise he remained carved from focus. The girl stirred once, barely, but her hand brushed against Bran's fur, and her breathing calmed, as if something familiar had found her even in the storm. Caleb stood near the doorway, arms crossed tight over his chest, jaw clenched. He didn't step forward. He couldn't. Not yet. Not until the feeling in his hands stopped remembering how light she had been, how easily she fit into the curve of his arms. Colleen returned with hot coffee in a paper cup and offered it without a word. Caleb nodded his thanks but didn't drink. His eyes were fixed on the girl. Something about her smallness, her stillness, it stirred something buried in him. 3 winters ago, he had carried his own daughter into an ER like this one. Same look on the nurse's face, same blur of overhead lights. But that night ended differently. This one he didn't know yet. He only knew the weight of déjà vu was suffocating. Hours passed, measured only by the soft beeps from the machines and the occasional shuffle of shoes outside the room. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with lines around her mouth that suggested she'd stopped smiling often, stepped out to speak with Caleb. Her condition stabilizing, hypothermia, early dehydration, no signs of internal bleeding, but her voice trailed off. But the bruising? Caleb finished for her. She nodded. Some of it is old, weeks, maybe longer. We'll run more tests. There's no record of her in missing children databases. No one's called about a lost child matching her description. She looked toward the bed. She hasn't spoken? Caleb shook his head. Not a word. But the dog, he wouldn't leave her. Even before I saw her, he knew. The doctor glanced at Bran, who now lay with his head resting just beside the girl's pillow, his eyes half closed but far from asleep. Animals know, she said softly. Sometimes before we do. Then she returned to the room, her coat brushing Caleb's sleeve as she passed. He stepped forward finally, just a little, close enough to hear the girl's breath without looking at the monitor, close enough to see that someone had brushed the tangles from her hair, but strands still clung to the edge of her mouth. He didn't touch her. He wasn't ready. But he looked down at Bran and whispered, almost inaudibly, "You found her." Bran lifted his eyes. No sound. No movement. Just that unblinking gaze, steady and deep as snowfall at night. The kind of look that made a man believe in something older than words. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass. Somewhere in town, families slept. Children curled beside fireplaces. Lights flickered off behind drawn curtains. But in that room, with only a child barely breathing and a dog that would not leave, something had shifted. Not a rescue. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of one. Mara woke in the early blue of morning, the kind of light that barely touches the corners of a hospital room, leaving most things in half shadow. The heater hummed gently in the ceiling, barely noticeable over the persistent rhythm of the heart monitor. Her eyes opened slowly, then closed again, then open. Not with fear, not with panic, just the slow, mechanical awareness of someone who's gotten used to waking up alone in unfamiliar places. Caleb was nearby, sitting in the same corner chair he'd occupied for hours, one boot resting over the other knee, arms folded. His badge was clipped to his belt, but his uniform looked slept in, wrinkled at the elbows and dusted faintly with salt where snow had dried. He hadn't spoken to her yet. He hadn't even stood. But when her eyes drifted toward him, just for a second, he looked back, didn't smile, didn't speak, just nodded, slow and sure as if to say, "I see you." Then he let her look away. Bran was still beside the bed. He hadn't moved much all night. At some point, someone had placed a folded blanket beneath him, and the nurse had left a small bowl of water near the wall. He hadn't touched it. When Mara's fingers twitched against the sheets, Bran lifted his head. His ears perked forward. Their eyes met. And that was when something imperceptible softened in the room. Mara didn't reach for him, But she didn't pull back either. And when he shifted forward slightly, laying his chin on the edge of her bed, she didn't flinch. That, for Caleb, was louder than words. Breakfast came. Warm oatmeal with a slice of banana and a cup of milk too full to carry. A quiet nurse placed the tray gently on the side table. "She hasn't said anything," she murmured to Caleb on her way out. "Wouldn't eat last night either." Caleb didn't respond. The tray sat untouched for several minutes, steam curling from the bowl. Mara stared at it. Then slowly, she reached out and picked up the spoon. Her hand was thin, bird-like, wrapped in hospital tape and bruises that looked weeks old. She scooped one mouthful, ate it. Nothing changed in her expression. But she didn't stop. When the spoon clinked against the empty bowl, Bran exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath too. Later, Caleb stepped out of the room. Not far, just into the hallway, where vending machines hummed and a bulletin board displayed missing pet posters and blood drive flyers. He stood there a moment, letting the quiet settle differently on his skin. Then Colleen appeared with a plastic bag, one of the clear ones hospitals use to keep personal items. Inside was the coat they'd removed from Mara the night before. Small, stained, pilled with wear, torn along one seam. Caleb took it without asking. His fingers brushed the inside lining. Tucked into a seam, barely visible, was something crumpled. Maybe paper. He didn't pull it out yet. Instead, he held the coat to Bran when he returned to the room. The dog sniffed once, twice, then looked up. His ears moved, alert, but not alarmed. Caleb leaned back against the wall, watching. That quiet again. Not just the absence of noise, but something more deliberate. He'd seen it before in soldiers who'd seen too much, in children in broken homes, in Bran after the blast that almost took both their lives. That kind of silence didn't mean peace. It meant waiting. It meant watching the world from the inside out. Mara's eyes followed every movement in the room, but not with curiosity, with calculation. Caleb didn't ask questions. He didn't offer reassurances. He knew better than to fill the room with words she wasn't ready to hear. That afternoon, a volunteer from the pediatric unit brought in a small bin of books and toys. Most were clean, colorful things meant to cheer. Mara ignored them all, except for a battered stuffed fox, gray around the edges and missing one eye. She picked it up slowly and set it beside her pillow. That was all. Bran gave it one sniff and then lay back down. The fox stayed there the rest of the day. By evening, Mara shifted enough to sit upright, cross-legged beneath the blankets. She still hadn't spoken, still hadn't cried. Caleb had seen dozens of cases like this, kids with broken arms or broken homes. Most cried, most screamed, some refused to eat. But the ones who scared him most were the quiet ones, the ones like Mara, the ones who didn't seem surprised that no one had come for them. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and constant. Through the window, the mountains of Missoula rose like sleeping giants under white quilts. A single crow passed overhead, black against the white. In the hospital room, the girl watched it, just for a moment, and then slowly she let her hand fall over Bran's back. Not a pat, not a scratch, just rested there. He didn't move, didn't lean in. He simply stayed. And Caleb, watching from the chair, let out a breath he hadn't meant to hold. No sound marked the end of the day, but something in the air shifted. A child had woken, a dog had waited. And the silence, still present, still heavy, now held something else within it. Possibility. The coat had sat folded in the corner of Caleb's truck all day. He hadn't looked at it since that morning in the hospital. Now, parked outside the station long after dusk had swallowed the streets, he reached across the seat and pulled it into his lap. The fabric was stiff in places, damp with old snowmelt and worn thin at the elbows. It smelled of cold and something older, wood smoke, mildew, the iron tang of forgotten places. Caleb ran his fingers along the seams again, pausing where the inner pocket had been stitched back by hand. That kind of detail didn't belong to someone who cared. It belonged to someone who had just enough guilt not to throw the thing out. Bran was in the back seat, silent. When Caleb shifted, he sat up. His ears twitched once, and his gaze followed the coat like it had breath of its own. Caleb didn't speak. He lowered the coat toward the floor mat, toward Bran's nose. "Go on," he said quietly. No command, just an offering. Bran didn't bark, didn't growl. He pressed his nose into the coat, drawing in a long, slow breath. His muscles tightened. Caleb could see it ripple through his shoulders. And then, without looking up, the dog turned his head toward the window. Ears forward, eyes alert. A single look passed between them. Caleb knew what it meant. There was a trail. He didn't wait for paperwork. The hospital hadn't found any records. No missing person reports matched Mara's description. No school calls, no names whispered through the city's foster system. That silence was its own answer. She hadn't been lost. She'd been erased. Forgotten not by accident, but by design. He slid the coat into a bag and tucked it under his seat. Bran was already at the door before Caleb opened it. They drove in silence, not the quiet of contentment, but something more brittle. Missoula's roads curved along the edges of the Bitterroot Mountains, and the fresh snowfall softened everything. Porch steps, mailboxes, even the battered signs outside town pointing toward trailheads and river access. Bran sat forward in his seat, posture stiff, nose to the wind slinking through the edge of the window. When they reached the edge of town, where the last streetlights flickered over mailboxes sunken in snowbanks, Bran gave a single low whine. Caleb slowed, turned onto a narrow road that led toward the edge of the woods. There, just past a half-collapsed fence, stood an old house with warped siding and shutters hanging like broken eyelids. The windows reflected nothing, only the dark. It looked abandoned, but not forgotten, like someone had lived here once and left in a hurry, leaving behind the weight of their silence. Caleb parked a ways off. Bran jumped out before the door had fully opened, paws crunching in the snow. He didn't rush the property. He walked it, circled, sniffed along the porch posts, the corners of the windows, the mailbox caked in ice. Then he stopped, turned once toward Caleb, and waited. Behind the house, where the snow had drifted deeper, Bran led him to a low shape beneath the pine trees, a slanted hatch, nearly covered in branches and crusted over with frozen mud. Caleb brushed it off with his gloves, heart heavy. One padlock dangled from a rusted bracket, broken clean through. Not by force, just old. He slid it aside, then pulled the handle. It groaned. Below was a stairwell, steep, damp, lined with frost. The smell that came up wasn't rot. It was older than that. Forgotten time, stale air, wool, and old metal. Bran stepped back, tail low. He didn't whine, but his ears folded halfway, and his breath came shallow. Caleb turned on his flashlight and descended. The space below was barely tall enough to stand. Cement floor, wood beams stained with damp. On the far wall, a pile of blankets matted down and crusted with what looked like old breadcrumbs and hair. Beside it, a broken chair, a tin can, and a small, lopsided drawing pinned to the wall with a tack, done in pencil, faded, jagged lines. A man with no face, holding a flashlight. Beside him, a dog, big ears, watching eyes. Caleb stared at the sketch, then looked down. Near his feet lay a loop of rope, not tied, not locked, just enough to suggest that whoever stayed here was not meant to leave, but not worth binding either. That quiet cruelty, the kind that says, "You'll stay, not because we force you, but because you have nowhere else to go." Bran let out a faint rumble. Caleb turned the light toward him. The dog was staring at one corner of the room, his body coiled, not to attack, just to bear witness. Caleb stepped closer. Scratches on the wall. Tiny, short marks, as if someone had been counting days, or trying to remember time. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He only stood there, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip, and let the silence wrap around him. In that stillness, he felt the weight of what had been left behind. Not blood, not violence, just loneliness, cold, hard, and shaped like a child's absence. When he finally climbed back out into the night, Bran was waiting, ears still forward, snow falling on his back. They stood there together, the hatch half open behind them, the town silent below the hill. And Caleb, breathing through something he couldn't name, whispered, "She never ran away." Bran didn't move. His gaze didn't drift. And in the stillness between them, they both knew. Someone had left that little girl to disappear, but she hadn't. Not completely. Not yet. The next morning unfolded under a sky the color of ash. Thick clouds pressed low over Missoula like a lid the town had forgotten it lived beneath. Snow hadn't stopped, not really, just changed tempo, slower now, as if even the sky needed to catch its breath. Caleb drove without the siren, without the police cruiser. He took his old truck, the one with the creaking fan belt and heater that clicked for 30 seconds before it worked. Bran sat beside him, unmoving, eyes forward, head just above the dashboard. Neither of them spoke, not in words. The old cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, where the trees thinned into hard light and wind made soft groaning sounds against the eaves. It had once been painted blue, at least that's what the flakes beneath the snow hinted at, but years of neglect had stripped it to wood and weather. The roof sagged in the middle, like something had once knelt on it and never stood again. Caleb stepped out slowly. The snow crunched beneath his boots in dull, heavy bursts. Bran circled ahead, nose low, his pace deliberate. This wasn't just searching. It was remembering. Behind the cabin, under a fallen pine, they found what they hadn't seen the night before. A second entrance, shallower than the first, buried beneath brush and snow. The wood hatch was older, rough cut, the kind used in root cellars and storm shelters decades ago. The hinges had rusted but not broken. Someone had cared enough to keep this place closed, just not enough to make it safe. Caleb pried the hatch open with his crowbar. The smell hit him first. Cold earth, rust, something like old animal bedding or burlap soaked through. He clicked on his flashlight and descended, the beam slicing through dust motes and cobwebs, landing on the uneven dirt floor below. This cellar was different, smaller, bare, except for the things that weren't supposed to be there. A mattress, flattened in the middle, foam torn at the edges. A pile of balled-up clothing in one corner, small enough for a child. A bucket, a cracked plastic toy with one wheel missing, and scrawled on the back wall in faint, jittery lines. Words, not names, not sentences, just single words, repeated. Quiet, still, stay. Bran didn't growl, but he pressed his body against Caleb's leg. The weight of him, steady and low, grounded the air like an anchor in wind. Caleb crouched beside the mattress and found it. The broken crayon tucked under the edge, blue wax barely worn. He turned it over in his fingers. It was the kind hospitals gave out in waiting rooms, ones just like St. Patrick's. His flashlight caught another glint. Nails hammered into the beams, too high for a child, some bent like they'd been forced through old wood with the wrong end of a tool. Beneath one, a piece of string hung limp, frayed at the edge. Not enough to restrain, enough to threaten. It wasn't violent here. It was worse. It was quiet. That kind of quiet children learned not to break. He stood. Let the light swing wide. No photos, no food, no blankets except the one pressed against the mattress, crusted with something he didn't want to name. He turned to leave, but Bran was frozen near the stairs, one paw lifted. His ears pricked toward the opposite wall, where the cement met the foundation beams. Something scratched. Very faint. Dry. Almost like paper dragged across stone. Caleb stepped close, put his hand to the wood. Then gently, without speaking, pulled away a section of loose paneling. Behind it, hidden in a shallow gap, lay the smallest thing yet. A drawing, folded once, torn along the edge, done in crayon and pencil. A house, a child, drawn with hair like scribbled shadows. A dog, tall, upright, with eyes. And beside the dog, someone faceless. A long coat, square shoulders, a badge sketched like a star. Above them, scrawled in block letters, "Found me." Caleb swallowed. The weight of it sat behind his ribs like snowmelt pooling where no heat could reach. He slipped the paper into his coat, turned toward the stairs. Bran followed without a sound. Outside, the wind had picked up. The forest made a soft, shushing sound that didn't feel like comfort. Caleb locked the hatch behind him, even though he knew it wouldn't matter. Some doors needed closing whether they could keep anything in or not. By the time they reached the truck, Bran's gait had slowed. Not from fatigue, from something else. Like he knew, too, what they'd just touched. Not evidence, not a crime scene, a memory. Someone else's. Left behind not because it was forgotten, but because no one had ever asked. Caleb leaned on the hood for a moment. His breath misted in the air, white and quick. The paper in his coat felt warm, even through the chill. He looked out across the snowy trees, then down at Bran, who stared back without blinking. "I need to go back to her," Caleb said quietly. Bran didn't move, just waited, as he always did. The hospital was quieter than usual. Outside, snow continued to drift sideways under the weight of a wind that never seemed to sleep in Missoula. Inside, everything held its breath. It was past visiting hours, but Caleb had learned that some thresholds weren't about clocks. They were about timing, and tonight felt like something had turned. He walked slowly down the corridor of the pediatric wing. The lights overhead buzzed with a soft, fluorescent hum. Bran's paws made no sound on the polished floor, but every few steps he'd glance up at Caleb, as if to confirm, "We're going back, aren't we? We're not done. Room 203. The door was cracked, just enough for a spill of warm yellow light to leak onto the tile. Inside, Mara sat upright on her hospital bed, legs tucked beneath her like a sparrow nesting in sheets too big. Her shoulders still hunched, thin arms wrapped around herself. The IV had been removed earlier that day, and her hair had been brushed gently, though some strands still stuck to her temple, where the skin was dry. The window beside her bed was slightly fogged with breath. She'd been watching the night. Bran stepped in first. No bark, no dramatic entrance. He simply walked across the room and lay at her feet, folding his limbs carefully, slowly, as if not to scare the silence. Mara looked down. Her fingers, resting on the blanket, twitched once. Then again. She didn't reach immediately. but she didn't pull back either. Caleb stood by the door for a moment longer before entering. He took the seat by the window. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He let the air breathe between them, filled with quiet machines and the occasional crackle of snow against the window pane. His jacket smelled faintly of pine smoke. He hadn't changed out of the clothes he'd worn to the cabin. Some part of him hadn't yet returned from there. Minutes passed. Mara's hand moved. Slowly, she placed her fingers against Bran's side, tentative at first. The dog didn't move. His breathing remained steady, a slow rhythm like ocean waves in some faraway place neither of them had ever seen. "I didn't think anyone would come back," she said. Her voice wasn't cracked or loud or trembling. It was flat, worn, like a sentence said too many times in her head before it found its way out. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at Bran. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "The dog did," he said, voice low, steady, the way he would speak to someone on a ledge. "He never left." Mara nodded. Not with surprise, with recognition, as if she already knew. They sat like that for a long time. The warmth from the room pressed gently against the edges of the cold still clinging to Caleb's bones. He studied her without intruding, the sharp line of her shoulder blades under the gown, the way she kept one hand flat on the blanket, as though ready to flee. But her hand stayed on Bran. "You have a drawing," Caleb said eventually. "In the cabin." Mara's lips parted. She didn't ask which cabin. She knew. He pulled the folded paper from his coat pocket, held it carefully. Her eyes flicked to it, then away. Her throat moved. "Didn't think anyone would see it," she whispered. "I did." A pause. Then something happened. Not in her face, not in her voice, in her breath. It hitched, caught for just a second, like a pebble dropped in water. Caleb didn't reach for her. He'd learned long ago that reaching could feel like pulling. Instead, he spoke into the stillness. "You drew a man, no face but a badge. You gave him a dog." She nodded. He continued. "What was his name?" She looked down at Bran, then whispered, "Doesn't have one yet." Caleb let out a slow breath. Something uncurled in his chest. He looked at the paper again, then back at her. "You get to name him." She didn't smile, but her fingers tightened just slightly in Bran's fur. Outside, a plow rumbled down the street, snow hissing off its blade. Mara blinked toward the window. "Is the place gone?" she asked after a moment. "No," Caleb said, "but it's empty now." She didn't respond, but he saw her hand rise to her own arm, rub it absently over the bruise still visible. Not to soothe it, to remember it. "I thought maybe, if I didn't talk, they wouldn't see me." "They didn't," Caleb said, "but Bran did." She looked at him for the first time, and in that gaze was everything she hadn't spoken. Hunger, shame, hope, fear, and something else. Something still too quiet to name. The machines kept beeping, soft and constant. Bran shifted, nudging his head further against her leg. Her hand moved to rest on the crown of his head. "I don't like talking," she murmured. "You don't have to," Caleb replied. Silence fell again, but this time it felt fuller, like the space between two people no longer afraid to be near. He stood, didn't say goodbye, didn't say see you tomorrow, just nodded once and stepped out. Bran stayed. Behind him, the light from the hallway touched the corner of Mara's drawing, where it now rested on the tray table. The words "found me" glowed faintly in crayon, soft as breath. It was nearly dusk again when the nurse handed Caleb a small Ziploc bag. Inside, folded tightly and worn from being hidden, was a scrap of paper. The corners were softened, the ink smudged, but the handwriting was still legible, sharp and uneven, as if written by someone in a hurry or someone used to giving orders that didn't get questioned. At the top, a grocery list: beans, bread, toothpaste, matches. But what made Caleb's breath catch wasn't the items. It was the scrawl at the bottom. In darker pen, as though added later, "Mara, do not leave the house, Darlene." No last name, no contact number, just the name. But Caleb's memory stirred. He took the note, his gloves already in his hand. The hospital lights hummed behind him as he stepped into the fading light of Missoula's early evening. Snow had started again, softer this time, floating instead of falling, the kind that settled more gently on your shoulders. Bran walked beside him, head level, his coat brushed clean but eyes sharp as ever. Caleb didn't need to tell him where they were going. The grocery store sat at the edge of town, just before the roads narrowed into country and the lights gave way to dark. It was small, family-owned, the kind of place where the cashier always asked if you wanted your receipt, and the shelves were never quite symmetrical. Caleb parked under the flickering street lamp, engine still ticking with leftover warmth. He didn't speak, just handed the crumpled note down to Bran, who sniffed it once, then again. Longer this time. The dog's body went still, nostrils flaring. Then, with a low chuff, he nudged the car door. Ready. They entered the store just as the evening lull set in. A few locals milled around, an elderly couple debating canned soup, a teenager sweeping near the milk fridge. The air smelled of cardboard and citrus floor cleaner. Caleb's boots echoed softly on the linoleum. Bran's paws didn't make a sound. She was near the back. Caleb saw her first in the reflection of the freezer door, tall, hunched slightly, a dark parka frayed at the sleeves, gray hood pulled halfway over a head of dyed black hair streaked with dull auburn. She was muttering under her breath, counting bills from her coat pocket as she picked up a bag of rice. Her face was sharp, sunken in places time doesn't touch kindly, her movements quick, habitual, the kind that came from always glancing over one's shoulder. Bran stopped 3 aisles away. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, but his tail dropped, ears forward, every part of him alert. Caleb lowered his voice, a whisper beneath breath. "You smell it too, don't you?" The woman turned slightly. Her eyes, pale hazel, ringed with red, flicked toward them. Just a second too long. Then back to the shelves. Caleb stepped forward, slow but direct. "Darlene?" She froze. The bag of rice slipped from her hand, landed with a soft thud. Her shoulders stiffened. She didn't look at him. "You've been here before," he said quietly. "With a child. Grocery list. Pink sweater." Still, she didn't speak. Bran inched forward, body low, eyes locked on hers. Then she turned. Not angry, not surprised. Just tired. "You think I hurt her," she said flatly. "I think you left her," Caleb answered. She licked her lips. They were cracked. Her hands shook as she reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a half-crumpled receipt, trying to fold it again. "She doesn't cry, you know," she murmured. "Never has. Not once. Not even when she fell down the stairs that day. She just laid there. Looked at me like I wasn't even there. Why was she in that cabin? Because I couldn't take her anywhere else." She looked past him now toward the front of the store. Nobody wants a 9-year-old who doesn't talk and eats like a ghost. "She's not a ghost," Caleb said, voice hardening. "She's a child." Darlene's jaw clenched. You think I didn't know that? You think I wanted this? Her voice rose slightly, then fell again, low and worn. I was 16 when I had her sister. That girl died. Drugs, foster homes. Then I got Mara dropped on me. Different dad. No one stuck around. Not even me. Bran stepped forward now, close enough that Darlene flinched. His breath fogged the cold aisle air. Caleb stayed silent. Let the space carry the weight. Darlene's voice broke again. I didn't beat her. I didn't scream. I just didn't have more to give. Caleb's gaze didn't waver. So you locked her underground. A pause. She was safe there, Darlene whispered. Bran let out a single quiet bark. It wasn't judgment. It was finality. Caleb stepped back. You're done now. He didn't cuff her. Not yet. Just stood with the weight of the moment between them. The stillness of a store where lives had passed like shadows, unnoticed. As Darlene sank slowly to the floor beside the spilled bag of rice, hands covering her face, Bran moved beside Caleb and sat. His gaze never left the woman who had left a girl alone in the dark. Outside, the snow was still falling, so softly it almost didn't touch the ground. The holding room inside the Missoula Sheriff's Station was quiet except for the steady hum of the overhead light. A narrow metal table separated them. Caleb sat on one side, arms folded, eyes tired but unwavering. Across from him, Darlene hunched forward, her elbows braced against the edge, hands clasped so tight her knuckles had gone white. Her coat was gone now, revealing a worn flannel shirt stretched thin across a frame that looked like it hadn't known warmth in a while. Her eyes, once darting and defensive, were still now, not softened, just resigned. Bran lay beside Caleb's chair, head on his front paws, watching. Not tense, not aggressive, just there, as always. Caleb didn't start with accusations. He didn't list the evidence. He didn't even mention the basement, or the drawing Mara had made, or the bruises that should have never been on a child's arms. He just watched her. And in that silence, something began to bend. You didn't ask for her, Caleb said quietly, not as a question. Darlene's shoulders rose, then fell. They called me, said there wasn't anyone else, said I was her only living relative. She laughed, short and dry. Living, not fit, just living. Caleb nodded slowly. And you said yes. I didn't say anything. They just brought her. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back down. She was so small, just stood there holding that stuffed dog, wouldn't let it go. She didn't even blink when they left. You ever ask for help? Who would I ask? Darlene's voice cracked, but she caught it quick. They would have taken her again, put her somewhere worse. I didn't want that. So you locked her under the house. Darlene's lips pressed together, hard enough to turn white. It was warm down there. I brought blankets. I left food. She didn't complain. She never cried. Is that what made it okay? She looked up at him now. The mask had fallen. What was left wasn't cruelty. It was hollowness. The kind of emptiness that came after years of disappointment, layered like dust. I didn't know what else to do. She didn't talk. She didn't ask for anything. She just sat. I thought, maybe she'd be better off not seeing the mess I was making out of everything. Bran shifted, his tail thudding softly once against the tile. Caleb reached down and ran a hand over his head. The German shepherd's warmth steadied something in him. He leaned forward slightly. You left a child alone for days, Darlene, in a place where no one would hear her. You didn't hurt her with your hands, but you broke something just the same. Darlene flinched. Not at the words, but at the calmness in them, like they couldn't be argued with. I was locked in places too, you know, she murmured. When I was young. Closets, basements, even the back of a truck once. My mother said it kept me out of trouble. Did it? Caleb asked. She didn't answer. Caleb stood. Bran rose with him, stretching, then sitting again at his side. She's not like you, he said, voice softer now. Or maybe she is. But either way, she's still got time. Darlene blinked slowly, her eyes shining just slightly before she looked away. The interview ended without shouting. No slamming of hands, no courtroom speeches, just a quiet conclusion to a long silence. When the deputy came to escort her out, Darlene didn't resist. She walked slowly, as if unsure whether what followed would be punishment or relief. Outside the station, the air had changed. The snow had stopped, and for the first time in days, the sky held a deep navy calm. Stars were beginning to show through the thinning clouds, faint and patient. Caleb stood with Bran at the bottom of the steps, hands in his coat pockets. He looked out toward the horizon, where the mountains held their vigil in the dark. He didn't feel victorious. There was no satisfaction in broken lives. But there was something else. Clarity, maybe. The kind that came when you'd looked someone in the eye and told the truth without anger. Bran nudged his hand once, then sat close, shoulder to thigh, solid as ever. They stood there for a while, the dog and the man, as lights flickered on in houses across Missoula. Somewhere not far away, a little girl would be eating a quiet dinner at the hospital, not talking much, maybe not smiling yet, but breathing steady, safe, and that was enough for now. The snow began to pull back from the streets like an old memory. Missoula softened at the edges, gray piles turning to slush, the trees along Greenough Park waking slow from their long sleep. The river still ran cold, but it had shed its armor of ice, water moving again beneath cloud-filtered light. Weeks had passed since that night. The girl was eating now. Quiet still, but not as brittle. Her hair had been trimmed, the jagged ends evened out. Tucked behind her ears with a pale blue clip Nurse Maggie had slipped her when no one was looking. She still didn't talk much, but her eyes met people's more often. She nodded when spoken to, sometimes even offered a small, guarded smile. She folded her napkins neatly at lunch and lined her shoes by the bed, like she was trying to give order to a world that had none for so long. Caleb came sometimes, not in uniform, a gray sweater, jeans that fit loose around his waist, and boots still dusted with the forest floor. He never came empty-handed, sometimes a dog biscuit, sometimes a small notebook and pencils. But most often, he came with Bran. On Sundays, just after lunch, they'd walk the edge of the park. No conversations, just footsteps and fur and wind. Mara held Bran's leash with both hands at first, knuckles white. Later, only one. She didn't tug. She didn't run. She simply walked beside him like she'd done it her whole life. Bran never pulled. He adjusted without command, keeping pace with her tiny stride, head lowered, gaze steady. Caleb followed behind, letting the quiet stretch long, never breaking it with questions. One Sunday in April, the hospital cleared Mara to visit the foster center. It was a small brick building tucked behind a Lutheran church, with faded murals of flowers and birds painted by children long gone. The place was clean, safe. But Mara wouldn't sleep that night. The nurses said she kept waking to listen, her ear pressed to the mattress as if waiting for footsteps overhead. The next morning she refused breakfast, curled up in the corner of the room, face turned to the wall. When Caleb came that afternoon, the staff met him at the door. He listened, said nothing, then drove to the station, grabbed Bran's leash, and drove back. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. When they entered, Mara was in the same corner, small and still, her knees drawn to her chest. Bran walked over on soft paws, nose low. He didn't nudge her. He didn't bark. He just lay down beside her, spine pressed to hers, eyes on the far wall. Mara's shoulders shuddered. Then slowly, her back curved into his. Not a word passed between them. But that night, she slept. And the next morning, she ate toast with jam. It became a routine. Not formal, no one scheduled it. But every Sunday, Caleb would arrive, Bran at his side, and they'd walk. Sometimes they'd sit on a bench under the sugar maples. Mara would feed Bran crusts of bread or just stroke the spot behind his ear that made his tail thump once, heavy and content. One day, Caleb brought a collar, not regulation, but soft brown leather, the kind worn more by family dogs than K9 units. It had a small silver tag engraved with Bran's name and a blank one beside it. He handed it to Mara. "If you'd like," he said, "you can keep it, just for walks." She took it in both hands, fingers brushing the metal, then nodded. She clipped it on Bran with care, her hands trembling only slightly. It wasn't permission. It wasn't possession. It was a promise. The weeks grew warmer. Blossoms pushed through the hard soil along the trail. The town shook itself loose from winter. But Caleb noticed the girl didn't laugh. Not yet. She smiled sometimes, soft and brief, but the kind of smile you protect with silence. And still, when they reached the corner where the wind came sharp off the mountain, she'd reach down and place her palm on Bran's back like she needed the weight of something real. One morning, a paper arrived on Caleb's desk. An officer across the county line had found a lead on Darlene's sister, someone who'd filed for custody of Mara once, years ago, then disappeared from the system. The report was thin. A name, an address out in Idaho, no phone, no job listed. Caleb folded the paper and slid it into his drawer. Later that week, he drove to the foster home, left the car running, and waited. The door opened after a moment. Mara stepped out. She wore a yellow jacket too big for her, hair tucked into a knit cap. Bran was already in the back seat. Caleb opened the passenger door. She looked at him, not questioning, just waiting. "If you want," he said, "we can just go for a walk. Maybe bring Bran to the park. You don't have to talk. You don't have to decide anything today." Mara climbed in, quiet as always. Bran's head immediately rested on her lap, as if this was all he needed to know. Caleb pulled the car into drive. The morning was still, birds nesting in the eaves, puddles glistening on the road. In the rearview mirror, Mara's hand was curled into Bran's fur. No declarations, no paperwork, just 3 figures moving through spring. One step, one breath, one silent afternoon at a time. There was no announcement. No signature day circled on a calendar. No courtroom or photo with raised hands. Just time, soft and steady, doing what time does when it's allowed to heal. The months slipped into each other like pages long turned. And somewhere in the quiet between Mara's footfalls and Bran's patient breaths, something changed without needing to be said. Missoula had leaned fully into spring now. The mountains still cradled snow in their highest creases, but the town was green again. Children returned to swings, porch steps were swept clean. Front yards bloomed with tulips that didn't ask where winter had been. And on some afternoons, if you walked the trail that curved along the north end of Greenough Park, you might spot a figure on a bench. Tall man in plain clothes, worn boots crossed at the ankle, a book open on his knee but rarely turned. Close by, a big German shepherd stretched in the grass, tongue out, eyes half closed. And riding in slow, careful loops around them was a girl on a dusty blue bicycle, her legs still too short to fully relax into the pedals, but getting stronger with every round. She never called him Dad. He never asked her to. But every Saturday she wheeled her bike out from the center's rack before the sun rose high, and by mid-morning, Caleb would be parked by the curb, Bran already watching the door. Sometimes she'd bring a drawing for him, crude sketches in crayon, always including the dog. Sometimes it was just the dog she greeted, throwing her arms around his thick neck and burying her face into his fur like it still held the scent of safety. Caleb learned to wait, learned not to press. The girl who once wouldn't eat unless Bran was beside her now helped bake oatmeal cookies at the center, wrapping extras in foil and tucking them into her coat for him. She never said they were for him, just slid them across the bench and turned her head. But she'd look back, always. The town had stopped asking. Missoula had seen what needed to be seen. People in the grocery store nodded now. The nurse from the pediatric wing once left a scarf in a paper bag on the front step of the station. Small, soft, yellow like sunlight. No note. Just a kindness passed forward. A retired librarian began leaving books for Mara at the foster center. Animal stories, simple and gentle, wrapped in brown paper and twine. One Saturday, someone left a tin of homemade dog biscuits with Bran's name on it. No one claimed credit. But in small towns, some truths settle like river stones, wordless, unmoving, but solid. By early June, Mara had begun walking Bran herself. Not far, just around the block if the evening was warm. Caleb would follow at a distance or sit on the porch, cup of coffee in his hands, letting the stillness spread out around him. The girl no longer flinched at slamming doors, no longer froze when someone spoke too loud. She still didn't talk much, but there were days when her voice, soft, papery, would break the silence in ways that needed no reply. One day, she pointed to a drawing she'd pinned to the fridge in the group kitchen. It showed 3 stick figures, a tall man with a square jaw and a line for a mouth, a large dog with lopsided ears, and a small girl with long hair and no shoes. The girl was holding the dog's tail. The man had his hand on the dog's back. Above them, in crooked block letters, was one word, here. She didn't explain it. She didn't have to. When Caleb saw it, his hands trembled faintly around his coffee cup. He didn't speak, just reached down and scratched behind Bran's ear, and Bran leaned into him the way he always had, as if to say, yes, this is enough. Caleb never asked the court to rush anything. There was no fanfare, just forms filled out in quiet offices, boxes ticked, and questions answered plainly. But one afternoon, Mara came out of school with a permission slip. Parent or guardian signature, it read. She held it out with both hands, eyes unreadable. Caleb signed it with a borrowed pen. No one said the word family, but when she handed the paper to her teacher the next day, she pointed at the name and said, "He's mine." And that was that. There was no plaque on the door, no mailbox with matching names. But the house where Caleb lived no longer echoed so loudly when the wind blew through the kitchen window. The guest room had a pair of boots by the door now, scuffed and muddy from the park trail. The living room rug had crumbs from late-night crackers and coloring pencils under the couch. The backyard had a rope swing tied to the pine tree. Not too high, just enough. Sometimes they ate dinner without speaking. Sometimes Bran sneezed loudly and made them both laugh. Sometimes the girl cried in her sleep, and Caleb sat by the door until the sounds stopped. But more often than not, there was peace. Not perfect, but steady, And if you stood across the street on a Sunday morning, you might see it. A girl on a bicycle circling slow and free, a dog trotting behind her, and a man on the porch, not watching over, just watching with. A family with no last name, no announcements, but real, quietly real. And maybe that's all some people ever need. Bran never spoke, but he never left. And sometimes that's all it takes to begin a home. Sometimes the quietest bonds are the ones that hold us together. Caleb never planned to become a father again. Mara never expected anyone to stay. And Bran, he never needed to promise anything. He just stayed. In a world that often asks us to move on, to toughen up, to forget. This story reminds us that healing begins when someone chooses to remain. Not to fix, not to rescue, but simply to be there quietly again and again. Maybe we don't need the perfect words. Maybe all we ever needed was a place to sit beside someone who no longer runs away. A warm hand, a steady paw, a quiet morning where no one is afraid. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you've ever been saved by a dog's presence, or by a person who stayed when everyone else left, tell us in the comments. We read every word, and someone out there might need your story too. Thank you for being here. Until the next story, may you find the kind of home that doesn't ask for perfection, just presence.